Good afternoon. My name is Federico Baradello. I'm the founder and CEO of Finalis, a FINRA registered broker dealer and deal infrastructure platform that is proud to serve over 460 investment banks and placement agencies across 24 different countries. Welcome to When Public Capital Meets Private Markets. The premise of today's conversation is simple. Government funding and private capital have historically operated on separate worlds. Grants and loans are on one side, equity and M&A are on the other. That separation is breaking down at an accelerating pace. And across the semiconductor space, energy, defense, artificial intelligence, and critical minerals, we're seeing the federal government deploy capital in ways that look less like traditional procurement and more like private investment. For anyone who works in capital markets, this creates a genuinely new set of questions. The timing of this conversation matters a lot. Over the past year, we've seen the federal government execute 10 direct equity investments at a speed and scale that's frankly unprecedented. Deals that would have taken years through traditional channels are closing in just months. That window isn't going to stay open indefinitely, which is why we wanted to bring this group together today. Today, we're proud to have two people who have been on both sides of this table. I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. A few quick items before we start. The views expressed today are those of our panelists, not Finalis. Some of you may be aware of recent federal equity transactions in the news. Our panelists are going to be in a position to speak to the broader dynamics and structures at play, but there are deal-specific details that are confidential and off limits. We'll be upfront around about those boundaries as they come up. We think of you as part of this conversation. We have an audience poll that's going to be coming up in just a moment, and we're going to hold questions for Q&A at the end, but please drop them into the Q&A box throughout. There's also going to be a short survey at the end. It takes just 30 seconds. It helps us know what landed. With that, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. Let me start with Secretary John McHugh. So Secretary McHugh served as the 21st Secretary of the United States Army, overseeing one of the largest and most complex organizations in the federal government. Before that, he served in Congress for over a decade, working on both sides of the appropriations and defense policy process. He's one of the very few people in the country who has seen government capital flow from both the legislative and the executive side. Secretary McHugh, welcome. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you covered the highlights such as they exist, Fed. But let me say to our audience that it's a real honor, a real privilege to be here today. I've had the opportunity over the years to work with Stephen and his team. It's a great team that does terrific work. So we're actually going to try to learn as much as we impart today. So thanks for the chance to be with you, and look forward to our discussion.
Delighted to have you here with us, Secretary McHugh. Let's turn to Stephen. So Stephen Empedocles is CEO of Clark Street Associates, a leading advisory firm and a Finalis affiliated investment bank that helps hard tech companies from startups to Fortune 500s secure government funding and strategic partnerships. Stephen holds a PhD in chemistry from a little known university called MIT. He started his career as a scientist and spent years in business development across the semiconductor and advanced materials space before founding Clark Street. His team brings together business development, technology, operations, and investment banking expertise, and they've secured more than $3.7 billion in federal and state funding across semiconductors, critical minerals, advanced energy, defense, aerospace, robotics, and AI. Stephen, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thanks for having me, Fed. And I can tell that we don't update our website fast enough because we've now closed $5.4 billion worth of deals. Yeah, thanks for having me today. As I say, I've worked at the intersection of commercial technology and government for the better part of the last 30 years. First as part of my own companies, and then for the past 15 years as part of Clark Street. Clark Street, as John mentioned, or Secretary McHugh mentioned, Clark Street is a very different, a very unique kind of government consulting firm. We help companies secure very large government grants, loans, now equity investments, but we're not the typical usual suspects of DC lobbyists or government insiders. We are commercial business development executives, deep technologists, manufacturing experts, operations people, finance people. And we're people that look much more like our clients than we do like the government customers we're pursuing. And that allows us to take a very different approach to going after these deals. When we take on a project, we will start by embedding ourselves inside the company. Develop a deep understanding of the company, their technology, their value proposition, and what they're trying to accomplish commercially. Then we do a deep dive into the problems that the government is trying to solve in that sector, and not just the banner level, press level problems, but really what does it take to solve those big issue problems? And then we connect the two. And that is a really powerful approach, and one that's led to some very successful deals for our clients that are high value both for our client, but also for the government. And as I said, that's led to now $5.4 billion in federal deals, including some of the largest deals the government has done in with commercial companies in a number of different sectors. Last month, we created a new partnership with Finalis to support this company is looking at this new space of equity investments that we're talking about today. And then a couple of weeks ago, we announced our first big equity deal, which is the second largest deal that the Trump administration has done so far. And I believe is the sixth largest deal that the federal government has ever done with a commercial company outside of bailouts. And that was a $1.6 billion deal for USA Rare Earth to construct the country's first fully vertically integrated heavy rare earth mine to magnet manufacturing plant. So, really focused on high priority national security, public policy issues, but a real problem and one that is really solved by this solution. So, again, good for the company, great for the country.
Thanks so much, Steve, and I'm delighted to have you here for this conversation. Before we get into the substance, we wanted to get a read on the room, and so we had a quick poll out asking, "What is your experience with public funding?" And in some respects, maybe we shouldn't be too surprised by the response. About 50% of you are saying just looking into it, and 25% of you are saying looked but never pursued. And that tracks. This is new territory for most of the market, which is exactly why we're having this conversation. We'll make sure in our answers to appropriately cover the fundamentals. So with that, let's get started. And I'd like to start, if I may, with a question to Secretary McHugh, which is, historically, Secretary McHugh, what has the role of the U.S. government been in funding corporate growth, and how?
Well, it's been in use for a long time, but as you kind of alluded to, Fed, it's been pretty well determined, pretty well defined into narrow areas and very select opportunities that have been deemed in the national interest. And you can go back, with the exception of the Postal Service and the United States military, the United States has had a lot of special interests, but only acted on a few very critical ones. The big three are cash, loans, direct cash to a particular effort, as well as loans and loan guarantees. But now, as you noted, things are getting a lot more creative. Now, that provides opportunity, but it provides challenges as well. How does an outside interest tailor its efforts in a way that is attractive and interest to the federal government? Can they fit into the areas of national security and national interests that have already been defined? And there's about 8 or 9 of those. And if so, how do they go about trying to secure those funds? So it's getting very complex, but becomes more and more rewarding as the stakes and the funds go higher.
No doubt about it. And I guess, one of the things that we had mentioned at the top was just this accelerated pace of the government's involvement in direct capital investments. Stephen, over to you. Why is this happening now?
I mean, it's frankly, President Trump is changing just about everything about how the government works. And I'm sure Secretary McHugh probably has a lot to say about that. But this is just one of those things, and it comes from the fact that the administration has a heavy bent towards an investment banking background, and frankly, this is an idea that makes a lot of sense for both for the companies and for the government, and it's just never been part of the thought process of traditional government insiders. I mean, government is a community that grows upon itself, and it certainly draws people in from among other places, but it rarely remakes itself in the way we're seeing today. Um, and I think, as John said, there have been funding vehicles for, I would say, for investing in that way into commercial companies that are doing things that are in the national interest. It hasn't been equity investments; it's been grants and loans and other non-dilutive vehicles, and those still exist today. I mean, don't get me wrong; that's real opportunity. Companies should be pursuing it. Equity is just the newest tool in the toolkit, and it brings with it some real advantages. I mean, obviously, getting an ROI for taxpayers, that's a good thing. But I think the biggest impact and perhaps the most value for companies and for the country is, as you mentioned, it's speed. Typical grants and other funding mechanisms for the government move at a glacial pace. It can take a year or substantially more than a year to go from start to a closed deal. And we're seeing some of these new equity investments move as fast as a few months. And that really is, I mean, I hate to keep using the word unprecedented, but it's the only word that really covers what we're seeing right now.
And so, I think, yes, please, Secretary McHugh.
I'm sorry, Fed. I just want to add a couple of comments, and Steve is right on point. I think one of the biggest drivers is that, unlike in the past, the United States was the big gorilla in the zoo. Our national security challenges have morphed very dramatically. We probably, without due diligence, allowed some of the critical nodes of national defense be offshored, microelectronics and other kinds of supplies. So I think the Trump administration, were they participating in this discussion, would say we see this as a way by which to really put a new tool in the bag where we can do a better job bringing those critical technologies, critical industry capabilities back onto shore and begin to build up our national security interests. The other thing, as a former secretary who went through the valley of death where very promising demonstrations took 2 years and more to get to actual funding, if you were lucky, this does, as Stephen absolutely correctly said, provide a rather accelerated way to meet some of those challenges. And you see it in the TSMC Intel agreement and a number of other agreements that would have taken years through the traditional budgeting process, but now can be done, if done correctly and in an appropriate way, much more quickly. And that's what's necessary in this environment.
No, that's a really helpful perspective. Thank you for that. I think back to Stephen, I wonder if you could share a little bit from the perspective of the company or the issuer. What are the unique advantages that government funding can offer that no other investor can?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing people need to realize is that you shouldn't think about the federal government as a financial investor. They are a strategic investor, and they're a strategic investor that is unlike any other because of what they can bring to the table. Uh, in addition to equity, bringing extremely favorable term loans. Federal government, some of the programs they have, not speaking specifically about any one deal, but are the deals they're allowed to cut can be as little as 100 basis points over Treasury for as long as 50 years, I think, is the longest. And so that's being used to great effect to add value to companies. These deals come along with, in many cases, with grants, not completely non-dilutive funding that are coupled to to stock or to warrants or things. But I think most interesting is that the government has a toolkit of things that no other company or investor has. Things like the ability to fast track permitting, provide access to federal technology, providing access to land, offtake agreements. I mean, things like that. I'll give you an example. Trilogy Metals is a critical minerals company with a mine in Alaska. They got a federal equity investment, and as a result of that investment, they had their market cap grew between that investment, which was summer, and now is stabilized at 150% boost as a result of that investment. That boost was not the result of the $35 million that they put into that company. It was because with that $35 million investment, they also gave them a road. And that road connected the mine to the rest of the world. And that took that mineral exploration company and turned them into a mining company. And that's the massive boost. Now, there's no other investor that could have done that. And you look at things like the MP Materials deal, which had a 10-year, 100% offtake commitment with a price floor. What other financial investor is going to offer that? So there's a lot of examples of those kinds of things. And I think that's one of the things that commercial companies really need to focus on is get the economics right, for sure. But make sure you understand what those tools are in the toolkit of the government so you know what to ask for, because it's not things you normally think about, but can be really, really impactful.
So let's take this back to Secretary McHugh, because I'd be curious to understand the flip side of that question. Earlier, Secretary, you were mentioning the fact that there's obviously national security prerogatives that the United States would be looking to pursue as part of these investments. But I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the structure of these transactions, because I guess the question here is, why should the government be interested in making equity investments into companies as opposed to standard and kind of historically standard funding mechanisms?
Well, I suspect for each one of those projects, there's a particular reason as to why it made sense. I wasn't in those rooms that made those decisions, but from the government side, I think, and also from the business side, so a federal equity position sends a lot of reassurance. The psychology of it, I would imagine, and Fed, you and Stephen would know far more about this than I do, but it says to the private markets, we believe in this and we're going to stick to it. The other advantage is it gives the federal government, whichever department is involved here, a seat at the table. It allows them to have discussions so that they can translate what they deem to be the appropriate public policy into whatever actions, follow-on actions that the company may make. So you really determine it as a win-win situation. And the other reason I would note is that, again, looking at TSMC and Intel, you can really bring a lot of power and a lot of influence to which way the company goes. So, it's good news on both sides. But as I think Stephen was referring to, you've got to, as a business, you've got to approach this very carefully. You got to be careful about your sovereignty, your way forward, and not give away too much. And from the government side, federal side, I think you've got to be very, very cautious about going too far, doing too much in a particular area that isn't deemed of national security, and having the Congress step in and maybe crush the whole way forward. So it's a balancing act. It's not unprecedented, by the way. The federal government in 1791 took a 20% position on the National Bank, which, as you know, was a private corporation and competed against other banks, but it was deemed in the national interest. So it's not been utilized like it is today historically, but there's a lot of history behind it.
I would imagine also that just there's broad appeal to bypassing the traditional congressional appropriations bottleneck.
Absolutely. That was the time frame I was speaking about.
Yeah.
If you think about a federal budget, And I watch this, and it's a little sobering when you know the details. From the first time someone in the Army budget office picks up a pencil to work on a budget two cycles down, to the time it goes to the Office of Secretary of Defense, goes to Office of Management and Budget, back to Secretary of Defense, President sends it to Capitol Hill, the two committees deal with it, floor, conference committee, back to the President. When the money is distributed, you're somewhere between a 2 and closer to 3-year budget. I guarantee you, Xi Jinping doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I want to do X, and it takes 3 years to get it underway. So I don't think this is going to become an instrument of regular budgeting, but it does in critical areas provide that compressed timeline, and that's really important in this day and age.
Yeah, I'll add to that because I think that is one of the primary reasons the government should want to do this, and I think does want to do this, is it is, it's not tied to the congressional cycle. And there's a lot we don't know about how this is going to grow over time, but it's an investment. There's a return on investment. There are liquidity opportunities. And in principle, this could become an evergreen fund that never has to go through that 3-year process, that it's something that continue to be invested in. Frankly, the deals that have been done have had, huge upticks in valuation, and the government could do that right now. I'm not aware that they have, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. But as John said, I mean, today Congress isn't really involved in this process. It's something that's being done by the administration with money the administration has authority to spend. Over time, Congress is going to become involved, and so there's a lot we don't know yet about how, for example, return on investment is going to be reinvested, and there's a lot to that, and I think we'll probably talk about that later.
Yeah, and before we get there, let's talk a little bit about just the hot sectors for government investment today. We alluded to the fact that there were an unprecedented 10 transactions over the course of the last year as equity investments by the government. Where do you, Stephen, see the greatest opportunity for government investment today?
Yeah, and so far we've seen big investments in semiconductors and critical minerals primarily, and I think we'll continue to see those. Although the areas that have been invested, rare earth minerals has been a big area. I think we'll see a few more of those, but I think we'll start to shift to other minerals in the critical minerals list. Tungsten, niobium. Uh, and so forth. So I think we'll see continued investment in semiconductor and in critical minerals. I think we'll also start to see investment into things like SMR, small modular nuclear reactors, and other energy or generation technologies that can be co-located with data centers. That's a huge area of focus for the federal government, and access to power is the number one limiting thing there. So what can the government do? They can drive investments in that space. Also investments in areas of grid-related technologies, things that can accelerate the ability to move power from somewhere else to data centers. I think we're going to see our first investments, ever in major investments in commercial fusion. That's a hot area, a lot of potential, still a ways off, but it's the kind of thing where the investment by the federal government today can actually catalyze the successful deployment of that over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think, and I know we're going to see the next big investments, or the first big investments in AI and quantum computing infrastructure, which are also now at the point where they're real. Everybody knows AI is real. I don't know that people realize how real quantum computing is today, and I think that's going to be a big area we'll see this coming year.
Secretary McHugh, anything you'd add from the defense or national security lens?
Yeah, I think there's pretty wide agreement of a list about 8 or 9 critical materials that the Trump administration will judge very carefully going forward. And Stephen mentioned a few of them. Obviously, you've got fusion and quantum, you've got AI, you've got unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned robotics, microelectronics, rare earth minerals, those kinds of things, even though there's no official congressional passed president signed list as to where these investments that we're talking about can go, I think there's pretty wide bipartisan agreement that that list is pretty acceptable. That's why I said earlier, the administration, I think any administration has to be somewhat careful. We don't want to have an equity position in grandma's fudge cookies, but where there is an agreement that this is important stuff, I think they've got the leeway to do it. But again, Stephen mentioned this is going to get more defined, if nothing else, going forward, in my judgment, only because Congress is going to want a more direct voice in this. They provided the funding for the 8 or 9, however many, 10 agreements that have occurred over the past 12 months, but they didn't have a say in what was the money spent on. And I think they're going to, if I know my former colleagues, they're going to want a direct voice, even if it's only pre-notification of what's going forward. So those 8 or 9 areas, I think, are pretty safe right now and a pretty good place to at least take a look at government investment and government partnership.
Secretary McHugh, let's keep this with you. I'm curious to get your perspectives on what you see as the biggest barriers to unlocking this opportunity for businesses.
From the business side, it's government. 2 words. It's somebody who's never had to live this and breathe it, stands on the outside and understandably gets scared as hell. You see layer upon layer upon layer of bureaucracy. You see hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people. You have no idea what they're doing or why they're doing what they're doing. You look at a Congress, if somebody dropped out of a spaceship and spent an afternoon in the gallery on the House floor, would go home screaming, scared to death. It's a puzzle. But once you do understand it, once you understand the opportunities that exist, it's worth engaging. But I give credit particularly to the agencies and particularly to DOD. They're trying to create offices that cut through the red tape, create transparency, make it easier, not easy perhaps, but easier for small businesses especially to do business with the federal government. There's a Linux provision or platform, APEFIT, Defense Innovation Unit. All these places are supposed to cut through the red tape for investors. I still think there's a real need to understand the mechanics, and they're pretty basic, but they do need to be understood of Congress and how that work gets done, and keeping an eye on the administration. So nobody has the money the federal government does to dispose. Nobody has the power and authorities to bring a whole lot of movement in furtherance of a particular market or a particular company. So the federal government stands ready in these times of challenge to try to find a way to work together.
Well, I can add to that. First off, I've been doing this for almost 30 years in one form or another, and Secretary McHugh just scared the crap out of me about doing it. Man, that sounds really horrible. But actually, I think it raises a good point, which is, one of the big challenges here is that nobody's ever really had to do this. All the stuff that Secretary McHugh just described, there is an entire industry of lobbyists and government consultants that have developed expertise, and companies that have developed expertise to go through that process, and it's very effective. There is loosely a playbook to work through that, and so companies can do it. Just like there's investment banking, and in Wall Street, I certainly wouldn't take a company public, even if I could by myself, because that's really scary. And I don't know anything, like companies don't know anything about that. So you hire experts to do that work because that's the way it operates, the same way DC operates, the other way. And now suddenly these two communities overlap in this area that neither one has ever had to deal with. And so that creates a gap. And that gap, although it sounds like it's scary, like, oh my God, how could you do that? I actually think it's the opposite. That gap is where the big opportunities are today. because people don't know how to do it yet. They're still figuring it out. The government is still figuring it out. And so the companies that are willing to move into that space and pursue deals now have an opportunity to really have an extraordinary amount of influence on uh on the structure of those deals. The flexibility of what it takes to get to yes is is extraordinary right now. And yes, it's work, and yes, it's confusion. And I think that sort of lack of clarity is what creates opportunity. And it's actually why we created the partnership between Finalis and Clark Street, because it allowed us to bring that deep government and commercial technology expertise with top tier investment banking resources in order to bridge that gap and help companies go after those kinds of deals.
Can I add 2 points?
Please.
So, if anybody asked me, is this doable? I'd say just look at the last 12 months. I mean, some of these initiatives were involving companies that probably 95% of Americans never heard of. So even smaller scale companies who are dreaming about big things can bring this together, and maybe they have the right help, but still it's highly doable. And I think clearly you see very, very strong signals from the administration. We're open for business, and we want to do even more of this. The other thing, I've had nearly a half a century, 50 years in local, state, and federal government, and one thing I've never seen, and that is a government program get simpler over time. Government programs get more and more complex. And somebody in Congress, somebody in the city council, somebody in the state legislature, and I've served at all three levels, always has the next great idea. Let's do more transparency, more effectiveness, more. And when you have more and more, what do you have? You have more. You have more T's to cross, more I's to dot. You have more forms to fill. So I'm just echoing what Stephen just said. There are many pages to be filled as to how this process works going forward. And I would strongly suggest anybody who is interested should get on the ground floor now while Congress is thinking about what they should do. You could help Congress think about what they need to do to make it work even better. So before things get too complex, the ground floor is much more stable than, floor 22.
I guess I'll continue to follow on this, but it's not just that the book is still being written, and the opportunity landscape is flexible, and it's absolutely true that over time things become more complex. Now, at the same time, the expertise on both sides of the table are going to become more solid as that happens. Once you start having a real playbook, people can start to learn to do that. Um, that means support will improve, I think, over time. I think what people may not appreciate right now is that as that happens, competition increases as well. Going through federal grants, contracts, congressional work, all of that. I mean, people have been doing that for a very, very long time, and companies are very good at it. And a new company going in can certainly do it. I mean, I've worked with Secretary McHugh a lot in the past, and I've seen him do incredible things with new technology and new capabilities. So it's not that you can't do it, but you're fighting against a lot of momentum of other companies in the space. There is no competition right now in this equity space. I mean, that's not entirely true, but at this time, not only is the government more flexible in how they do deals and very unburdened by red tape, but it's an open playing field for companies to go in and present their value proposition without an incumbent there to have to unseat. There is no incumbent.
So maybe let's dive a little bit deeper into what the current playing field actually looks like, and start to unpack the mechanics for those that are joining. So how does this actually work? What the process looks like today? I guess maybe just starting things off, Secretary McHugh, curious to get your perspective. What criteria does the government look at when deciding to invest, and what does the process look like today?
Well, right now the criteria is as they have long been, and that is are what you want to do, is what you want to do important? Does it align with what has been agreed upon generally are the national security interests? And we've talked about those areas where investment opportunities exist and the federal government is interested in going forward. How that looks in the future, I don't know. I've just seen so many government programs grow way beyond where they initially started and where the most good was. I really hope the current administration and future administrations contain this initiative to the areas where everybody agrees we've got to do better there. It's in our national interest. Let's assume that happens. Then, as I mentioned, there are a host of offices within the federal agencies, and if you look at the 8, 9, 10 equity agreements over the last 10 months, they're spread only across 3 departments, as I recall: the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense. So it's not like you're looking at the entire government, but each one of those agencies has a place for companies who are in these critical spaces to go and plug into and at least get a start and get a face, get a person to actually discuss it with. And if those offices fulfill their role, they're supposed to help you to continue along the path of development. The other path is, as Stephen has said, and as McHugh LeMay Associates, I'm the M and MLA. Uh, we're there to help, and there are a lot of folks. I worked on K Street for a long time. There's a lot of offices down there who are around to help as well. But this really is a very, very ripe opportunity that, believe it or not, is attempting to become less complex. Just the other day, may have been when the last 2 days, the Department of Defense announced the Economic Defense Unit and is going to spend $266 million. And what is this office intended to do, pursuant to a Senate Armed Services Committee directive, to coordinate capital and industrial capacity and to bring those things together as an instrument of national power. So that says we're awful serious about this kinds of stuff, and we want to work with you. So I think everybody on the government side's headed is in the right place, and I think there are ways to make it work for both sides.
Stephen, anything you want to layer on? I think, especially for the folks that are just new to this space, I think a basic question could be, is there a checklist? What are the hard things that the government is actually evaluating?
Right. I mean, I'm going to answer this in 2 separate ways, and one is following on to Secretary McHugh's comments, which is the government doesn't make investments because it makes the best possible financial return. They make investments, whether they're grants, whether they're equity. They make investments because they accomplish certain national security objectives, and that means that the motivations for doing that start there. I mean, that's table stakes in a deal. Um, and what's interesting and important to understand about that is that's not just, hey, there's a line in a list and now that says we should do this, and then an investment banker walks in the room and says let's structure a deal. That's something where there is an entire ecosystem of people that are stakeholders in that line item and that ultimately need to agree that this is the thing that's important to do and that a particular deal is one that accomplishes that. And that's unlike traditional Wall Street investments. I mean, you get an investment banker, they have a small team, they decide an investment is the right thing to do. They do due diligence where they bring in experts to evaluate different things, and then they make a decision and go. The breadth of stakeholders who are responsible for things like our national defense, who you have to bring to the table, is from an outsider's perspective, it's very daunting. Again, there is a process by which you bring those people together, and Secretary McHugh and his team are absolutely fantastic at that. But it's still a thing that needs to happen. So somebody that walks in the door, um, Secretary Lutnick, Howard Lutnick has been one of the major deal makers, at least the most visible deal maker in the government. You don't walk in there and say, "Hey, I've got a great idea," and he writes you a check. Um, it may look like that, and it certainly moves at that kind of a speed. But he's being advised by a lot of people who are saying this is the right thing to do. Um, uh, so that's one half of the answer. The other half is it does need to make financial sense. It does need to be a good return on investment. That's not going to win the day if you don't have the other things. But it can't just be a good technical solution to a problem. It has to have long-term commercial viability. It has to be something that an investor would look at if you were a strategic investor who really cared about that one thing. Has to be something that you'd put your money into. And to a point that came up earlier in the discussion, and this is, I think, really important. These deals are moving really fast compared to traditional deals. That does not mean that these deals are happening with less due diligence or less care in the decision making process. In fact, based on my experience in a handful of projects, the level of due diligence that's going on right now is substantially more than what we've seen in the past, even for deals that might take a year and a half to get done, because it's not a serial process of a bunch of people say yes here and then it moves to the next group and then it goes here. I mean, that's the red tape process that Secretary McHugh was alluding to. Um, it looks like an investment bank. They come in, they look at a deal, they say this is something that is going to address our key investment thesis. Then they do deep due diligence on all aspects at the same time. They gather enough information to make a good investment decision, and they cut a deal. I mean, it's not nobody's sitting around Wall Street doing deals that take two or 3 years to figure out whether you're going to put your money in, and so I think that's important because it is definitely a misperception that speed is always at the expense of diligence. That is definitely not the case here.
Stephen, let me actually ask a question. So I'm company X. Let's say I'm the mining company in Alaska that you mentioned earlier, and the Ambler Road is closed down 211 miles. And if I go in to the Department of Defense or to Department of Commerce and say, if you can open that road, I can do great things with the minerals that are sequestered there. That was by the way, that road closure was a purposeful decision by the Biden administration and in deference to the wildlife refuge. I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong here. I'm just saying that the decision to open it was not just some willy-nilly thing. My question is, how closely does a company who wants to do business have to know what they want? In other words, what can I get from the federal government, and also a plan of justification? I X amount of dollars, I need a regulatory change, I need a change in zone, whatever it is, and then just a general discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I can guarantee you that Trilogy Metals knew they wanted a road. I would almost guarantee that discussion was give me a road, and then the government said, okay, but we want some equity rather than the other way around, particularly because the equity investment was very small. Um, but I don't think companies fully appreciate the tools in the government toolkit. And so I think it is critical for a company to come into the room knowing what they want, but more importantly, what they can ask for. Because the government is trying to get a yes on these deals. You put something that addresses a national security issue in front of them that makes good financial sense and meets all the rest of the metrics. It costs them nothing to fast track permitting or to whatever it is they have to offer. And so those are things that they are. I mean, I'm not saying they just throw them in and nobody thinks twice about it, but they're willing to bring them to the table. So there are easy things like I mean, permitting. You'd say, hey, we want to build this facility, give us some money to do it, and gee, it would be great if you helped with permitting. But other types of regulatory relief. I'll give you an example. There's $2 billion um, in the Japan trade deal allocated for building copper smelters in the western U.S. That money is going to a company, Falcon Copper, to build, the first new smelters in, I don't know, 50 years or something in the US. That's a big deal in terms of our copper supply, because that midstream processing, we have plenty of copper in the US. We just don't have any real midstream processing of it. $2 billion for that. Well, lo and behold, there was an executive, not an executive order, but something out of the White House about a month before, drastically cutting the environmental regulations around specifically building copper smelters. Were those two deals and things coupled? I don't know. I wasn't part of that deal. I can guarantee they were. And so but was that a thing that Falcon Copper walked in the door saying, we want you to completely change the western half of the United States regulatory requirements in order for us to do this? Probably not, because who would even think that you could do that? Other areas like offtake's an easy one to think about. But understanding how the government can offtake, where can that go, how much money can you ask for, over what time? A lot of thought went into the MP Materials deal, not just guaranteeing offtake, but also integrating a price floor, integrating time, making sure that the equity investment into that facility is going to be wildly successful, because it's defined by the government market. So anyway, that's a long answer to yes, you should know what you want. And that's where I'm going to put it back on you. That's where experts like you come in, is you do understand all the things the government controls, and therefore can help companies think about which of those things is possible and which of those things is valuable. And we obviously spend a lot of time talking with companies about things that can help them drive commercial value and market value from that side, and that's why we work well together.
Stephen, that's a great segue. Secretary McHugh, I'm curious, from the government side of the table, what role do advisory intermediaries like Clark Street play in making these transactions actually work?
Well, believe it or not, for all the complexity we've talked about with respect to the federal government, the agencies and interests like CSA, like MLA, really do blocking and tackling. We try to stay up on exactly what's happening regulatorily and with respect to the budget and all the other initiatives. We've talked about a few of those through the various agencies. But we have to understand the fundamentals. We have to distill those layers upon layers of bureaucracy, those hundreds of thousands of people, into who's who in the zoo. Where do we go to get the latest information? Where do we go to get the decision maker on an appropriation or some kind of other component in an equity deal? Who are the agencies that are involved? And not inconsequentially, who in Congress is being looked to actually guide these policies, whether it's somebody on the committee of jurisdiction, or often somebody who just has a lot of respect of his or her colleagues going forward. So we try to get you to the right place to talk to the right people and help you make the argument as to why you'd be a good partner, whether it's an equity deal or something else. And to help you go forward, not wasting a lot of time roaming around the halls of the Pentagon, knocking on doors, and hope you get the right person.
Stephen, same question for you from the advisory side.
Yeah, and I will say Secretary McHugh and MLA are vastly more expert at all the things he just talked about because of that complexity. The thing that's unique about Clark Street, back to something I said earlier, there is a whole industry of lobbying that understands how the government works, but doesn't fully understand how a company works and how you drive enterprise value in a company in different sectors. Then there's a whole world of investment bankers and Wall Street that understands how you translate a capability into market cap and into liquidity and all of that. The piece that's in the middle is the company, and And just like, company doesn't know how to go public without expertise, they don't know how to go and pursue all of the complexity of the government without expertise. Um, it's hard for companies to take. Uh, I mean, it's a lot of work for a company to sit down with an investment banker and figure out how to go public, and do all the work that's needed to do that. Um, there's a long, long history of people helping with that. Um, Same thing with on the government side, and there's a long, long history with the lobbying world helping companies do that. But for companies that have never done it before, stepping in and saying, "Okay, we're going to have experts that are going to help us get in front of the right people, are going to tell us what we ought to do," and then translating that into a transaction, going through and and presenting your technology, your capability in a way that truly resonates with a public policy objective and all that. That's hard, and it takes a lot of work, and it requires an understanding of the government side. It requires an understanding of your capabilities, and it requires an understanding of your business and where you want to go with that investment. And a lot of companies struggle with that. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And most companies that are just getting into government, commercially focused companies that are just trying to engage with the government, don't have a bunch of, I mean, how many companies do you know that just have a bunch of extra executive business development resource to go figure out the government, particularly if what you're looking for is one deal or two deals? That's hard. And it's the thing that when we created Clark Street originally was the problem we were trying to solve, which is our team comes from the commercial side and the technology side. And so we can sit with a company and fully understand what is their capability, what does their technology do, why is this something that's extraordinary, um, w- translated into why should the government care, not with a level of depth that Secretary McHugh has, but a level of depth that creates the value proposition people need to hear. Um, and also understands what's it going to take to create real value in the company, not just money for money's sake, but money for valuation impact sake. Um, that was a gap for many years. It's still a gap. I'm not aware of any other firm. Other people talk about being able to do this. I'm not aware of any other firm that fills that end-to-end solution. Um, and that's where, we've been doing that for 15 years. That's where we saw the opportunity as equity popped up, isn't, suddenly that gap existed again. We weren't expert in everything, but that's where partnering with Finalis has allowed us to fill that gap in the same way that partnering with Secretary McHugh and his team has helped us, bridge the original gap.
Absolutely, yeah, because the moment you start engaging in equity advisory, you have this whole spectrum of compliance and execution backbone that's necessary to get an investment bank stood up. And that's precisely what Finalis does to support firms like Clark Street to deliver on this type of advisory work. We're coming up on time, and I do want to transition to Q&A. Let me hand the stage over to Secretary McHugh. I'm curious, Secretary McHugh, if you could share just a final word before we open things up. For the founders, bankers, and operators on this call, what's the opportunity that they should take away from today?
I don't want to be flip about it, but I would say the dinner bell is ringing. Uh, there are there are opportunities here that occasionally pop their heads up, but not to the scope that we have seen over particularly the last 12 months. And while I told my tale of horror and nightmares with respect to the federal government, I was trying to give the message that it's not as bad as it may seem from the outside. And when you're talking about Fidelis, you're talking about Clark Street. There may be other relationships in this town in DC that can do what they do, but I've never seen it. So if I would advise you to go talk to somebody, it would be them. And together, I think we bring the kinds of capabilities that know how to do the fundamentals, know how to get you where you need to be. And in the partnership between Fidelis and Clark Street, you have the opportunity as well as the capabilities of taking that extra step and getting in on a ground floor of amazing amazing developments and amazing opportunities that I see just continuing into the near future. So I really appreciate, Fed, your monitorship here today. And Stephen, as always, it's great to see you. In particular, thanks to the folks who took the time out of their busy day to join us. I hope the discussion was of some interest and maybe even some value.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. So let's pick up a few that we've received. We did receive a large volume of questions, so unfortunately we will not be able to get to all of them. Uh, let's start with you, Stephen. One question from the audience here is direct government investment replacing more traditional forms of government funding like grants and loans?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Those are still vehicles. They're still valuable. They still, roughly follow the same kinds of processes. Non-dilutive funding is great, and I would take advantage of it in every case that you can. This is just a new tool that the federal government is using and is often using in conjunction. The USARE deal was a combination of equity plus loan. Other deals that were certainly that we're aware of and perhaps working on are combinations of equity and grants, equity and other things. So no, don't abandon those. And I'll also echo Secretary McHugh's statement just now, perhaps not quite as colorfully, but my key recommendation is don't wait. The field is open now, and it's going to narrow over time. The money that's available right now is going to shrink. uh, the fact that there aren't a lot of people in this space creates a lot of opportunity for probably for the next 18 months, maybe 24 months. But, it's right now is the time.
We've received a cluster of questions around kind of this notion of best practices that companies should take into account when engaging with the government. Is there anything you, Stephen, or Secretary McHugh, that you'd like to layer in on that?
Uh, I guess I'll comment is know your customer. I mean, that may seem obvious, but it's not. The government is a weird customer and they're motivated by weird things. And they're motivated by things that traditional investment bankers, are not. Traditional investment banker may not care that a company helps position the United States as the global leader in AI. And that may be the primary reason that the government wants to make an investment. So, and that's where folks like Secretary McHugh come in, is really understanding that piece.
Yeah, I could add, Stephen's absolutely correct. Uh, you have to know your customer. I think the other thing you need to understand is exactly what the government is saying. Sometimes the internals and the structure of a particular deal are elusive to a person whose main experience is in the private sector. What the government says in its own language isn't always apparent to folks in the private sector. And so you have to take a very hard look at what the government is asking for and what you're prepared to deliver. It's not Greek. It's not a lost language. It's just a common sense and a business practice kind of way. Government, as Stephen said, not only talks differently, but it also behaves differently. Budget cycles are different. The requirements under federal law, the FAR, the federal acquisition regulations and such, are a little bit different than how the private sector works. So just understanding who you're talking to and what they're saying is vital. And that just means be careful. And again, I know this sounds like a sales pitch and we didn't intend it this way, but that's why people like Clark Street Associates, like Finalis, if you're looking to go public, and frankly, stuff folks like us and others on Capitol Hill are willing to help in that endeavor.
Well, and with that, we are at time. I want to thank Secretary McHugh and Stephen for a conversation that I think gave this audience something that you can't get from a white paper or press release. The recording of today's session is going to be sent to everyone who registered, as will a link to a survey that should take just about 30 seconds to fill out. So we ask that you please do that. And please do share the webinar video to colleagues who couldn't make it today. If today's conversation raised questions specific to your company or transactions that you're exploring, both Clark Street and Finalis are available to continue the conversation. You can reach Clark Street at clarkstreetassociates.com and Finalis at finalis.com. Again, please take the time to fill out the survey. It's going to help us to understand what resonated with you. Thank you all for your time.